All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another Wednesday for our Western Slope critical business updates. I am Erin McCuskey. I'm the Regional Director for the Northwest Colorado Small Business Development Center. And today I want to give a quick shout out, first and foremost, to our partners who help put on these calls. Several times a week, we meet and we talk about what's going on for our small business community on the Western Slope. So I want to thank Startup Colorado, our various Colorado SBDCs, the Telluride Foundation, Ogallala Commons, GROW, SECO, and the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade. So today we're going to be talking about COVID-19 financial resources, kind of a recap of what's going on right now, because if you are anything like me, I'm a little bit lost with all of the news that's been circulating, talks about changes to legislation, and personally, I'm feeling just a little bit confused about where things stand. So we're going to try to recap it for you so that you can feel a little bit more confident about where we're at. We're going to kick off the call with Kat Pappenbrock from the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade. She's our Rural Opportunity Representative, and she's going to be talking about current grant and funding opportunities. Then we'll turn it over to my co-host for this call, Bonnie Watson from the Telluride Foundation, and she's going to be providing an update on the Energize Colorado Gap Fund. And finally, Mike O'Donnell from Colorado Lending Source will give us an update on the PPP, that recent legislation, and kind of where things stand with the forgiveness application. We're planning about 20 to 30 minutes for a live Q&A, so that we'll have plenty of time to hopefully be able to get to your questions on this call. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kat to talk about grants. Thanks, Kat.
Yeah, thanks so much, Erin, and welcome everyone. As Erin said, I think we're all in this kind of limbo phase right now. We're kind of in between federal funding legislations. You know, as a business owner, you may be in a situation where you've maybe received funding or were left out of initial funding and are kind of wondering what to do next in the gap that we're facing now and continuing to move forward with your business. Or you may be on the other side of things where you are actually looking at starting up a business, or maybe you're in a position where you're able to expand it. So I'm going to kind of do a little overview today of the funding landscape that's out there right now, both for COVID and then for additional just general business funding. I'm going to be outlining a couple of resources. They're by no means exhaustive. They're just a couple of highlights of the types of things that you could look for. Next slide, please. So in preparing for this presentation, I used to be a small business owner myself, and I really had to walk myself back and say, you know, if I were a business owner, what would I be looking for right now? Right, I'm either in one of those two positions where I either need additional funding, I may be in a position where grants are really the only option right now, and I can't take on any more loan debt. So I kind of went back on our OEdit page. We've shared this quite a few times, that COVID-19 business resources page that has a lot of the existing funding opportunities. And within that page is a spreadsheet that's linked to it called Alternative Sources of Funding. And I'm just going to do a really quick overview of that one. I've also, after the call, we'll have a curated list that's really designed for Western Colorado, kind of taking out those ones where it doesn't apply to the counties per se and that sort of thing. So hopefully it'll make it a little easier. But if you're in that worksheet, the easiest thing to do, honestly, as a business owner is to download it and then kind of search and sort your activities. So you could search by industry, you could search by county, or you could search by funding type. And again, I'm kind of coming at this from a position where if I were a business owner, you know, I've kind of also exhausted my local banking relationship, right? Because you always want to go local first before you kind of start looking outside. So the way that each of these things that I'm going to be looking through is looking at local funds first, whether that's in your municipality, your county, you know, local foundations, those sorts of things, regional and statewide funds, and then national funds. As we know, as you kind of start to scale up, there's probably going to be a little less touch, a little less guidance, and definitely a much broader pool of people competing for the same resources. Next slide, please. So let's start with grants. The grant landscape is continuously changing, especially for COVID-specific grants. I know that a lot of our local communities and foundations have stood up grants for businesses. Those are exhausted really quickly, but they continue to come online, and we really try to work hard within that alternative funding spreadsheet to capture those and make sure that they're recorded. One thing, if you don't know, is that certain city and county governments are actually, in addition to kind of ongoing deferrals, you may want to check in with them about that. That's just kind of a cost savings measure, not necessarily a grant. But the CARES funding does allow for certain COVID-19 expenditures to be provided to small businesses. Now, not every community or county is able to do this. They may have their own expenses, but some of them have been standing up funds. Again, most of the ones that I've dealt with before have sort of rotated out at this point. So really that landscape is a little small as far as your kind of local grant funding landscape goes. That said, if you're in Grand County, the Grand County and Grand Foundation Emergency Small Business Fund is still open. So that would be one example of something that you could go for. National grants, they're kind of all over the place. You've got industry-specific ones. Again, you're competing in a really big pool. But one that's going to be opening up at the end of the month that I did want to highlight is the Lowe's in partnership with LISD Small Business Relief Grants. They're opening up a $55 million fund. Granted, it is a national grant. However, they are targeting women, minority, and veteran-owned businesses for $30 million of that grant and rural businesses for the other $20 million. So that's definitely one that really applies to all of our small businesses on this call and is one that you might want to watch. Next slide, please. Additionally, you've got some industry-specific grants. The first one under agriculture and food systems, again, is national. But if you are a food producer and you've seen more than 5% losses in specific crops, you apply for the USDA Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. And you can just check in with your local USDA or FSA office. The link that's linked here as well outlines all of the different crops. They've just added a whole slate of new ones as of last week. So even ones that were left out of the original portion are still in there. And they've also extended the application period for that one. The other one, I tend to not put funds up. I didn't want to in this presentation that are currently on hold. However, the Colorado Farm and Food Systems Respond and Rebuild Fund is, again, a smaller grant, I think $1,000 to $5,000. That they are planning on reopening. So that would be one if you're a producer. Again, it's local to Colorado, kind of a smaller pool that you're quote unquote competing with, and how terrible that we all feel like we're competing with each other for funding. But again, but based on COVID-19 losses. So just keep an eye on that one. Within arts and culture, obviously, we've seen that our entire industry there has just really kind of been brought to the ground, especially when you're talking about performing arts and music. So the Colorado Music Relief Fund that was set up back in May is still open, specifically for musicians through the end of September. So that would be one if you are a musician or somebody in the music industry that's been seeing losses. And then this other one, I just realized, I do apologize, it's been a week for all of us. This one is actually a loan, but it does look at creatives and businesses within the Durango Creative District who have suffered losses. And it's a really low interest and kind of lower amount loan to kind of help you get through. Again, going on a national level, if we're looking at minority, women-owned, and veteran funding, the Red Backpack Fund is one that is pretty expansive for women-owned businesses specifically. And that alternative funding spreadsheet has a lot of national links that are really targeted to minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses. But that's one that has kind of a larger fund balance to it and will be opening. And then the last one, of course, our restaurants have been suffering incredibly. So the Colorado Restaurant Association still has its Angel Relief Fund open. This one is really more for restaurant workers. And again, because of the amount of applications that they've been getting, they have had to limit it to employees who have basically been out of work because they have been diagnosed with COVID. But, you know, if you have somebody in your business that's suffering with that, or you yourself are, that's certainly an option. All right, next slide, please. So on the loan side, and these are going to be COVID-19 specific loans, these tend to be kind of lower in the total amount that you're looking for. So anywhere from microloans of $500 up to, usually they cap out at about $25,000 depending on the loan. but they tend to have really, really competitive or even zero interest options, longer term deferrals on your payments. So it's definitely something that you want to check in with. A lot of our larger municipalities in the area have set up business emergency funding. So you can see the Montrose one there, Grand Junction, Fruita, for example, those are all still open. And then regional and statewide is where it really starts to get broader, especially as far as rural Colorado is concerned. Greenline Ventures has an emergency microloan program that's really targeted to women and minority businesses. First Southwest Community Foundation still has its Rapid Response and Recovery Fund open for all of rural Colorado. The Colorado Lending Source, we're going to be hearing from Mike a little bit later. They still have some emergency loans available as well. And then First Southwest has a second one for our specific sort of southwestern Colorado counties in partnership with Region 9. The Telluride Regional Emergency Loan Fund, also going through for Southwest, is still open as well for if you're in those counties. And then again, if you're looking at minority and business, there's actually a rural women-led business fund for those of you who may be in the San Luis Valley. Again, in all of these, you usually have a nonprofit lender and kind of outside philanthropic support that's then routing, through one of the nonprofit lenders that I'll go through on the next slide. Other options, if you're with an online payment processor and you feel like you just need a line of credit, your larger national processors like QuickBooks and Square all have basically capital loans available that then make repayment really easy based on your sales if that's something that you're comfortable with. And then again, kind of going a little further, of course, higher interest, but as a business owner, you kind of work on everything that you can. There's your credit card capital and lines of credit. Next slide, please. So if you are in a position where you might be starting up a business at this point, or you're looking to expand or looking for capital investment in your business, this is where things start to open up quite a bit more. Of course, if you're looking for specific regional resources, I'm just highlighting a few here. You can always check in with us at OEdit, Startup Colorado, your local SBDC. They're all going to know exactly who your local revolving loan fund is, who the CDFIs are that they work with, and other opportunities. Those revolving loan funds, if you're not aware of them, they tend to live either within a city, within an economic development corporation, or even a regional council of governments or economic development district. And they're really designed for gap financing. This is a situation, again, where you've kind of exhausted your options with your local bank or your banker, and you're still looking for additional funding. These tend to be for businesses that are already established. So I'm just highlighting here the Southwest Colorado Economic Development Business Loan Fund in Region 9. Region 10 has a similar one, and most of our other areas do as well. Another option, if you're a business owner who tends to not have availability to traditional lending sources, maybe you don't have a strong banking relationship, or you're building your credit, or you're still a slightly earlier stage business, these community development financial institutions and nonprofit lenders are incredible partners for you. They're really there for those underserved businesses to really help you build your creditworthiness and banking relationships. They tend to do sometimes even character-based loans. They provide gap funding, and again, smaller amounts up to larger growth amounts. Again, this runs the gamut from that micro loan of $500 just to kind of get started and test a proof of concept, up to larger capital expansion funds. And just a couple of the ones that I've outlined here that sort of serve all of rural Colorado and then specifically southwestern Colorado would be the Colorado Lending Source, Colorado Enterprise Fund, Greenline Ventures, the First Southwest Community Fund, Telluride Regional Loan Fund. There's certainly more, but that's definitely something that as you're talking to either your bankers will also a lot of times have relationships to those, or again, your SBDC. On the private capital side, if you're a startup, and I realize I should have flipped these, if you're a startup, we are so lucky in the Western Slope of Colorado to have some incredible venture organizations that really help incubate your business, work through your kind of ground plans, and then eventually connect you to funding. So that's the Telluride Venture Fund, which runs an accelerator program, your Grand Junction Business Incubator Center, Scape in Durango, CoVenture in Carbondale. Sorry, I missed the link on that one. IceLab at Western for example. Additionally, through OEdit, if you find yourself in an opportunity zone and at that link, there's a really easy way to click and see if you live in an opportunity zone. They are right now running what they're calling a Business Capital Accelerator program. And this is for businesses who are looking for investment. They need to either be in an opportunity zone already or relocating to an opportunity zone. And this will basically take you through a program that builds up your prospectus, gives you some guidance, helps you really organize what you're looking for in terms of capital investment, and then eventually gets you ready for investor conversations and connections to investors. It's open to 6 businesses right now. The application is still open. So we'd love to see some more businesses that are looking to expand, invest in that, and work with us. It's some great free training. And then finally, if you're in the advanced industry field, again, sort of a smaller group, but definitely have some sectors in Western Colorado. There are so many competitive national programs for advanced industries, as well as some pretty great statewide programs that help you move forward on those. And then just a really cool one, when we're talking about COVID adaptations that I just continue to smile every time I see it, is the food truck loan program. First Southwest Community Foundation has put this one out for those entrepreneurs that are looking to both respond to COVID or just expand their business model or even start their business model with a food truck. And so it's pretty much open to all of rural Colorado. So if that's something that you've always had a dream of doing, it's a really fantastic program to get you started. With that kind of wraps it up. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time. Again, that list of the curated resources for Western Colorado will be there. And now with probably the biggest one that I left off of my list, the Energize Colorado Gap Fund, I'm going to turn it over to Bonnie.
Thanks, Kat. And can everyone hear me? Is my mic okay?
Yes, we can hear you, Bonnie.
Perfect, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Watson. We know that the Colorado Gap Fund, there's been a lot of buzz around it. There's been a lot of information about it. And so we wanted to bring this resource to you today and walk through the qualification process and who can apply and a lot of the frequently asked questions that we get on the Colorado Gap Fund. So I've had the good fortune to lead the rural team with Energize Colorado and have been very integral in a lot of the work here. And so we're really excited to share this with you. Next slide, please. Next slide. Great, thank you. So what's the purpose of the GAP Fund? If you're tuned into Energize Colorado, you know, Energize Colorado was created to fill gaps across the state of Colorado where mentorship, funding, and any resource for small business was maybe missed. And we identify those groups that possibly were left out. And that's really where the GAP Fund came from. We're identifying gaps in funding that were missed by federal and state stimulus packages through COVID. And so it's really a targeted approach in capital, and it's targeted towards the businesses who need it the very most. And so we're really focusing on minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned, and rural businesses within the state of Colorado. So it's $25 million of mixed grant and loan money. And so essentially the package, you can apply for up to $35,000 of funding. $15,000 of that will be grant money. And if you need additional funding, there is also the ability for $20,000 in loan funding. Next slide, please. So there's two pieces here that we have to think about with the GAP Fund. The first is who is eligible for the GAP Fund. So it's small businesses within the state of Colorado. That includes contractors and sole proprietors, and also nonprofits within the state of Colorado. And when we talk about nonprofits, there's always lots of questions around that. Happy to answer them. But we're really focusing on nonprofits whose mission and or programs directly support economic development, small business, or tourism. The other eligibility piece for the fund is that you have to have fewer than 25 employees, and we mean full-time equivalent employees. And so we can get into this, but essentially the designation here is you can, one employee is, one full-time employee is one employee and a part-time employee is half of an employee. So essentially if you had 50 half-time employees, that would qualify. So happy to answer questions there. And then you also have to prove an impact by COVID. And so you have to prove economic hardship in relation to COVID. And so this, we'll go over it in the grant section, but really this can be proved in a variety of methods, whether it's bank documents, profit and loss, tax records, whatever it may be, but you do have to prove economic harm from COVID. Next slide. So there's eligibility, and then there's priority. And we get lots of questions around this because this is not a first come, first serve fund. You're eligible, but then we take priority over these individuals. So we really take priority on businesses majority owned by Black, Indigenous, people of color, veterans, and women. Or if you live in a rural area with a population less than 50,000 people, or you're in the tourism sector, or you have limited to no access to capital financing or other kind of federal, state, or local grant and loan incentives. And so even though your business may not fall under the priority, but does fall under the category of eligibility, we highly encourage you to still apply for the fund because we do look at these businesses first that fall under priority, but it doesn't mean that you're excluded from the fund by any means. Next slide. So the hot topic is obviously grant assistance. We understand that a lot of businesses don't want loan assistance this time. And so the buzz is really about the grant proponent of Energize Colorado Gap Fund. So you can be awarded up to $15,000 in grant money. The total fund, there's $20 million of CARES Act funding in the grant proponent of this fund. And so there's a lot of stipulations because it is federal money, how we can and cannot use the money. So we do have $5 million earmarked for the tourism sector until until October 1st of this year. So to qualify for the grant, you have to provide economic harm, and you have to be able to prove that to the committee. And so you have to be able to prove a decrease in revenue from a stay-at-home order, from voluntary closure of the business to promote social distancing measures, or from the public and health emergency. You can also prove increased costs to operate the business due to the pandemic. So for example, increased costs to buy plexiglass or PPE, masks, anything like that. And you have to prove the loss between March 1st and the time of application. Next slide, please. So on the other side, the loans are quite a bit more flexible. And so you can apply for between $5,000 and $20,000 in funding. The maturity is 24 to 36 months. And the GAP fund is on a tiered interest rate structure. So it's 0% for the first 4 months, 1% up to 12 months, and then 1.5 thereafter. There is no payment for the first 4 months, and these loans are secured. Whether it's a personal guarantor or collateral of the business. But really the big thing here with the loan, it's much more flexible because it is provided by the nonprofit lender, and they have a lot of flexibility amongst how they want to structure the loan. So just keep that in mind. Your loan, however, is not quite as strict as the grant proponent. The loans can be used for both current and future needs, but all of this will be determined by who your underwriter or who you are partnered with, and we'll get a little bit into that as well. Next slide, please. So a big question, will my business receive assistance? Great question. So again, applications, this is not a first come, first serve basis. This application is based on eligibility and priority groups. When you apply, when you go through the application process with the GAP Fund, you will be partnered with a financial provider. There's a huge network of nonprofit providers, but if you've already worked with one, like for example, for Southwest Community Fund or Bank, you can directly request to work with them as you already have that relationship. So grants will be offered before loans depending on the availability of the funds. And so essentially how the grant proponent will work here is that it will be tranched out until the end of December 31st. That's when the CARES Act money has to be utilized or at least committed. And they will release tranches for the grant money. And so they'll release the money, open up the applications, and then they will close down the application process to allocate that money. And then they will open it up again until all of the grant, all the $20 million has been allocated. So we realize that 25 million is not a lot of money for the entire state of Colorado. And so there are far more deserving businesses than we will have funds to assist here. So just keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So what is required to apply? So you do have to provide documentation of economic hardship that you've experienced. And again, this is between the time period of March 1st until the time of application. And so we get lots of questions around how to do that. If you're a sole proprietor, it's likely bank records showing a decrease in revenue from previous years. If you have a P&L or tax return, you could show year-over-year historicals showing last year's profit against this year in COVID. You can use point of sale or register and receipts, profit and loss statement, tax filings, and expense receipts as well. Keep in mind that when you do apply for the grant proponent of this fund, you do have to, if you provide a P&L, for example, showing the expenses, you do have to provide proof of payment, receipt, things like that to really verify that you spent the money. But you know your business best, and so we want to be flexible, and we're here to help you and are definitely willing to work through that. So next slide. So how do I apply? Great question. EnergizeColorado.com /gap funds is where you can access all of this information. So keep in mind, there is no application date set right now. We are eagerly anticipating that date, which will happen very soon, but we don't have one today. So you can go to Energize Colorado to the Gap Fund section, and you can sign up to receive updates and emails. And then you will get notified as soon as the application is open for funding. So you can apply for both application and grant there. You can apply for both loans and grants there. And it is available in Spanish. The application is available in Spanish. Technical assistance is available in Spanish for the fund. You can also apply on your cell phone through mobile. So just a little bit, and when we send out our email after this call, I am going to put in the webinar that Energize Colorado did on Monday. It's called Understanding the Gap Fund, and their team really runs through the application process in detail. We don't have time to do that today, but I'm just going to give you a really high-level overview. So once the application process is open, you will go in and you will register your account and verify it. And then you will have access to what we call the application portal. And so like a little bit different than Int'l and things like that with federal care, there is going to be a portal where you can check in to see the application and the status of your application. So you will get logged into the portal, and then you're going to do a preliminary application. And the purpose of this is to make sure that you really do hit the eligibility requirements for this fund. And if that happens, then you will be given the option to actually apply for the fund. And we get lots of questions about how long will it take for the award to be determined. They're estimating after application about 6 weeks to know when, if you have been awarded the money. Next slide, please. So how can you get help? You can call the hotline right here. It's 1-800-471-0628. They are open 7 days a week from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. You're always welcome to email the Gap Fund directly, and you can see their address there. And then as you're going through the process, there will be live chat assistance on the application. And again, these resources are offered in Spanish. And then again, you can visit EnergizeColorado.com for not just resources on the Gap Fund, but you can access mental health resources, mentoring resources, PPE resources. There is a wealth of information out there. Next slide, please. And so folks, I just really encouraged you as we're going through this. That was a very high level introduction of the Gap Fund and all of the resources here. So please utilize that Q&A function. We're happy to answer your questions. We will have a Q&A here at the end of the session. But as you're thinking about that, enter those in there. With all of that to be said, I'm super excited to introduce Mike O'Donnell with Colorado Lending Source to give us an update on PPP and forgiveness. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. You're a hard act to follow, so I'll try and live up to half of the expectations that you've presented. I'm going to talk with you about the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, specifically about the forgiveness aspect of that. And so I have some slides. Really, just as we talk about forgiveness, forgiveness actually opened up on the 10th of August, but for loans approved before the 5th of June 2020, the loans that you got under the PPP was a 2-year loan, and the lender may agree to extend that to 5 years, or you may request that it be extended to 5 years. The covered period during which you could look at to spend the funds you received to apply for forgiveness was 8 weeks, 56 days. With the change of the legislation on the 5th of June, you now may choose to spread that out over 24 weeks. And you've got an alternative period, so it typically 8 weeks beginning on the date the loan was dispersed. But if you have a biweekly or a less frequent payroll schedule, you can start that 56 days if you use the 8-week period on the first of the pay period after the loan was dispersed. But what really changed over the last, at least with the legislation a few months ago, is that forgiveness application deadline is now no later than 10 months after the date of the covered period. So if you're working with an 8-week period, you have 10 months after the end of that 8 weeks to apply for forgiveness. If you're looking at a 24-week period, you have 10 months after the end of that 24-week period to apply for forgiveness. So essentially you've got, there's a lot less pressure on the back end in applying for forgiveness than there was at the front end in actually getting your application in before funds ran out. And then if we move to the next slide, it just really talks that if your loan was approved after or on the 5th of June, it is a 5-year loan. It does have a 24-week covered period. You can't use 8 weeks. And again, you've got the option, if you have a different payroll starting period, you can go back to using the 8 weeks in that case. And again, it's the same forgiveness application deadline. And so if we move to the next slide, if you don't submit an application in 10 months, and there are people who will probably forget or people who don't, the bank's perspective, the lender's perspective, because we helped with a lot of PPP loans ourselves, is to notify the borrower the loan is no longer deferred. And you might recall when this program was originally rolled out, it had a 6-month deferral period, but then that's now at least 10 months. It's 12 months in many cases. It's much longer than that for people who were approved after June. And we have to tell the borrower if they don't submit their forgiveness request, what the date that their first principal interest payment is due, what the new payment amount is, and what the maturity date is. But a little wrinkle there is that you can still submit for forgiveness after the 10 months. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but the deferment period is ended and you're basically in that process at that time. And again, I'm just going through some high level things here in terms of the different sort of approaches. There are 2 forms currently that you can use to apply for forgiveness, the 3508 and the 3508EZ. This EZ form is a shortened form for certain of the borrowers, people who are self-employed independent contractors with no employees at the time of the application, borrowers who didn't reduce salary or wages by more than 25% and didn't cut the number of employees or the paid hours, and borrowers who didn't reduce salary of employees by more than 25% but were unable to operate at the same level of activity due to compliance with specific health and safety requirements per the Flexibility Act. So you'll see a little bit of current sort of overlap here with Energize in the sense that for the people who were impacted and had no choice in being impacted by forced closures, the opportunity to work on the EZ form is actually so much simpler than the 12-page 3508. And the SBA, in their wonderful way of doing these things, is estimating that it's going to take you about 20 minutes to do the simple form and about 3 hours to do the longer form. So if you can do the shorter form, please do. And then the next couple of slides we'll run through. When the lender gets one of the forms, they have to confirm, and there's actually a lot of work from the banker's perspective, and this is why a lot of lenders were hoping that the Congress would actually pass rules and regulations that made forgiveness automatic for loans under 150,000. So once you get a 3508 form, the lender must confirm receipt of all the certifications, confirm receipt of all the documentation to support the payroll, non-payroll costs, have to check all of the borrower's calculations, because apparently not very many people have calculators anymore on the different pages, and confirm that the borrower made the calculation on line 10 by dividing 1 by 0.6. So there's a little bit of work that a bank has to do in terms of its due diligence. The bank has to do this within 60 days of receipt of a completed application. And then the next slide sort of says similar things for the 3508EZ form. A few less calculations from the bank's perspective, so that can go through in less than 20 minutes. And then I think the next slide, when you apply for forgiveness, the bank has 3 things it can do. It can approve it, it can partially approve it, or it can deny it. If they partially approve what you're asking for, we, the lender, have to notify you in writing, and we have to give you a bunch of information and reasons. And you can request a review of the partial approval within 30 days of denial. And then if it's a full denial, which is the next slide, you will see that we have to tell you that we disagreed with your request, and again, give you the chance that, tell you this is when the balance of your loan will actually start, payments will start. And then you can still apply for review as well. So for some businesses who apply early, your loan, the deferral period might be actually shorter because it will really start to impact you after the application has gone in. And if full denial, this is what we do. So we can jump onto the next slide because, again, I'm not as eloquent as Bonnie, I apologize. So if it's full approval, then we send the forms into the SBA. The SBA confirms it. We collect a little bit of demographic. And to be honest, the SBA did a really bad job at trying to understand who's getting these loans. And there's really no really solid information who's actually received PPP loans, despite some of the things you're reading in the media. But we are trying to rectify that a little bit. The SBA has a very, very lame demographic page on the back of their forgiveness forms, both of them. Colorado Lending Source will actually modify that for the forgiveness we process so that we can actually understand who's actually getting these loans. So once the full approval goes through the bank to the SBA has 90 days from submission to review and submit payment to the lender. And then the next slide will show what happens if the SBA pulls a loan for review after it's been submitted by the bank or the lender. So the bank will be notified pretty much straight away. The borrower has to be notified in 5 days that the SBA is auditing this particular request. And then the bank itself has to collect a bunch more stuff that they probably already have to submit to the SBA for their review. The SBA has indicated that requests for PPP above $2 million will automatically be pulled, and randomly smaller requests will be pulled as well, which is why we in the industry were really hoping that the 150K and below would be automatic. And then if it doesn't get pulled, the next slide will tell you that the SBA has 90 days to send the payment back to the lender. And then the borrower is notified by the lender that the SBA has sent the money to the bank, and which means that the note can be paid in full. If it's only a partial approval of the forgiveness or a full approval of the forgiveness, full denial, I should say, again, it's all back on the lender to let the borrower know what's going on. So there's been a few banks that have actually worked through this process. And I just looked at a report today from a bank which launched its forgiveness on the 10th of August, which was the start date. They actually sent reminders out to the 12,000 PPP loans that they'd submitted. And they got not very many requests coming back in because, again, borrowers aren't in any great hurry at the moment to get the forgiveness because, again, if they don't get forgiveness, the loan doesn't start until 10 months after the end of their period. And some banks just period are not accepting forgiveness requests. We are one of those. We're still waiting for a little bit of guidance from the SBA. And we do know that their House has agreed to meet again next week. And there may be some second chance to get that 150K and less forgiveness automatic. So with that, my last chart is just a picture, or my last picture is a picture. But I'd be happy to, as we share these slides, if anyone has any questions later on, we'd be happy to address them too. But PPP, a little more complicated than getting forgiveness and applying for the loan in the first place. The irregular form is quite complicated and very burdensome to complete. And you may need some help to get that done. If you can use the easy form, please do that because it's just much simpler and almost automatic. So with that, I'll pass it back to the moderator. And if anyone has some questions, I would be happy to answer them. Are you in charge, Bonnie? I'll just be quiet now.
Thanks, Mike. We certainly appreciate it. So folks, again, for the remainder of the call, we would like to open this up to a Q&A. So please use that Q&A function to ask any questions. Beth just asked a question. She said, is this recording available to us? Yes, absolutely. We will share that in the follow-up email for you so that your staff can watch that. With that being said, I'm going to monitor Q&A here. Our team's going to watch it. But since we have a little bit of time here, I am going to just put out some of those frequently asked questions that we get asked on the GAP Fund very frequently. And so the first is, do I have to be registered in the state of Colorado? Yes, you do have to be registered in the state of Colorado with the Secretary of State, and you do have to be in good standing to apply for the GAP Fund. You also have to have a federally issued identification number. So you have to prove, you have to have a social security number, an EIN, or a TIN, but it does have to be federally issued. Another question that I get frequently is there a prepayment penalty on the loan proponent of this? No, there's not one in the state of Colorado, so you can pay this off early. There is no exclusion there. As far as individuals who can apply for this, farmers, yes, you can absolutely apply for this. And with that question always comes, can you use this for a cannabis type company or industry? And the answer is no. However, you can use the funding for hemp if you are within the federal and state guidelines and operating appropriately within your business. Another question is there a cutoff date for the GAP Fund? No, there is no cutoff date at this time. However, remember that the grant, the $20 million in grant funding does have to be allocated by the very end of the year, so December 31st. Another question we get very frequently is the grant money taxable? Is the money taxable? And the answer is grant money is taxable. The loan proponent is not. So keep that in mind, grant money is taxable. Something that I really didn't go into, but your grant or loan money cannot be spent on the following things. So expenses that have been reimbursed under another federal program, you cannot use that. You can't double dip. It's the same rule with PPP and IndustrySpecific. You cannot double dip into federal funding because, again, this is CARES Act funding. You can apply for other expenses that were not covered by PPP or IndustrySpecific or any other kind of funding, but you can't double dip with this fund. You cannot use it for losses that have been or will be covered under any other federal program. You cannot use the funding for taxes, lobbying, or any kind of capital purchase. And when we say capital purchase, we mean something that is costs more than $25,000 that has a lifetime value of more than 5 years. So just kind of, keep that in mind. Another question that I frequently get is, what does rural mean? Great question. What in the heck does rural mean? When you apply for the fund, they've built a very nice map to show you what rural means, but essentially by definition, it's a county with a population of less than 50,000 people, a municipality with a population of less than 50,000 people. So it's really that 50,000 population that is the qualifier there. Something else, and let me just check Q&A here. Something else that I think needs a little bit of clarification is, what does majority ownership mean, and does that disqualify me from this fund? So one example would be, if you are a woman in a business, but you're a minority owner in the business, perhaps that doesn't disqualify you because you're not majority. You should still absolutely apply for the fund. That is taken into consideration. So if you're of any kind of minority group, and you are a minority owner, please, still apply for the fund. You still qualify, but they do certainly take that into consideration. Another question is that, for-profit and nonprofit can get kind of tricky. And we seem to get lots of questions around the nonprofit part of this. So remember, for the nonprofit to be able to be eligible for the fund, you have to describe how your nonprofit's mission and programs directly support small businesses, tourism, or economic development. And then there's that demographic question, and that affects the preference points for the application. And so the nonprofit will need to answer yes or no whether their mission primarily serves racial or ethnic minority, women, veteran, or rural businesses. So something to keep in mind there. And another question that we get very often is, no, there's no ownership because it is a public entity. And so instead of looking at the board of directors maybe, or who operates the nonprofit, say it's a veteran or woman, women that are running it, that's not really what we're looking at. We're looking at who are you serving in your nonprofit. We have a question from Marcia here. Are independently owned and operated primary care outpatient clinics eligible? We're a partnership and LLC. Marcia, it's a great question, pretty broad. I would say that as long, you need to go back to your eligibility requirements and look at that to see if you qualify for the fund. So again, keeping in mind 25 or fewer employees, where you're located. So maybe we can take that one offline and get a little bit more specific. You do qualify if you're a partnership though. Great question there. And let's see, so a couple other things. Let's see, what classifies as an increase in cost and what can you use funding for? So it's not just, remember, it's not just a decrease in revenue that you have to prove here or you can approve, but it's also increased costs. So what falls under that as an expense to your business in response to COVID? So payroll costs, obviously, and this is going to sound a lot like PPP for good reason, but payroll costs, which includes worker compensation, hazard duty, overtime related to the pandemic, the list goes on there, but it's payroll costs. Rent can also be covered, equipment, real property, livestock depopulation, programs to implement COVID social distancing measures, training to mitigate impact for employees furloughed due to COVID, and inventory for items to mitigate the COVID impact. So those are all very applicable uses of the funding to cover expenses. Again, you can't double dip though with the fund. So I don't see any questions with
Bonnie, we actually have a couple questions in the chat for Mike. So I'll jump in if you don't mind, because Mike, we'd love to ask you live. We've gotten to hear a lot of great options today, but what are you recommending to customers who walk through the door and are looking for funding for a quick fix? What do you see as the best options right now? Are there other loan options that people should be considering?
Quick fix is probably not the right word. I know it's not going to be a quick response to COVID, but there definitely, I really like the Energize Fund and getting that launched. It will be a little, because of the period of application before you can actually hear, it'll take a little longer than I would have liked, but that's perfectly fine given that we're now dealing with federal funds and a lot of requirements on the back end for distributing those funds. There are definitely a lot of local and communities have created programs that can really help. For example, we will be helping the City of Aspen launch a little fund next week to help some of the businesses in Aspen access funding relatively inexpensively. We've done that in several other communities. Trinidad, we have 0% loans there. We also work with a program called Kiva. We're a hub for Denver, and Kiva, for those of you who know, Kiva is a crowd lending platform. 0% loans. And when we've worked with Rachel, who's our employee who works really on the behalf of Kiva, we've done more than about 50 or 45 of those projects so far this year. And those are just loans up to $15,000, but can help some businesses as they grow or as they survive. The EDA fund should be announced hopefully soon for the state of Colorado, which will be another new program distributed throughout the state by Region 9, as well as by ourselves and Colorado Enterprise Fund. So there are lots of things that are happening and popping up. Some of them will work really quickly, some of them will be a little slow. So really keep tuned in to Startup Colorado and all of the resources shared that Bonnie mentioned on the Energize page as well, and on the OEdit page for the state of Colorado, lots of different resources. These will eventually sort of slow down, but we still have a big push from both the state government, a little bit perhaps more from the federal government, and definitely from local governments. And we nonprofit mission-based lenders are still trying to find as much funding as we can to help businesses as well.
Thank you. I think my takeaway is there are a lot of options, but it can be tricky to navigate. I think that's why we are all feeling a little bit overwhelmed and a little bit lost within it all. And so small business owners, we want you to know you don't need to go it alone. Just reach out, and there's lots of mentors at this point who are set up to help navigate some of these solutions.
Always be happy to answer any questions that people might have as well too.
Yeah,
there's lots of
thank you,
different
Mike.
choices.
One other question that came in, Mike, is what do you think is the most important thing people need to know right now as it relates to PPP forgiveness?
I think the big game changer on the PPP forgiveness was increasing the period from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. And so, you all have, as PPP recipients, the opportunity to use the 24 weeks. In fact, you have to if you're approved after the 5th of June. And they also changed the ratio. So I think it's just 60% of those funds need to be deployed on payroll. And what was happening during that first couple of rounds was that the businesses were still shut. It was really hard to bring people back, and it was really hard to spend 75% of your proceeds on payroll. So now that you're able to stretch that out over 24 weeks, there's no reason why most businesses shouldn't be able to get 100% forgiveness. But you'll just have to be able to collect that documentation and keep that. And that should make it really, really easy for the lender to process it as quickly as we can. This article that I'm looking at from the other side of the country talks about the fact that for every 1,000 PPP loans that a lender has, they're receiving about 6 calls or inquiries every hour during the business day, and then 3 calls or inquiries every hour during the off business hours. So banks are going to be a little overwhelmed by the PPP. So as much as you can simplify and make it easy for the lender to actually look at it, process it, and get it into SBA, the quicker the loan can actually be written off or paid in full, I should say, not written off. So that's the objective. And again, you've got 10 months now to apply. So you've got time to get your act together, and it's not the mad rush it was when the program opened. So I hope that helps a little.
That's very helpful, Mike. We have another question coming in here for you. Question is, if you were closed for 3 months, do you have to get back to that full-time employee count for PPP forgiveness? We counted ourselves as owners, but we're not paying ourselves now, so we may need to be short on FTEs.
Well, if you are still working in the business, even if you're not paying yourself, you can still count yourself as FTEs. And again, you've got the 24-week period. There's also something in the Act that says that even if you can't get back during the 24-week period, if you can by the 31st of December get back, you are still eligible to apply for full forgiveness. So it gives people a bit more of a runway. I'm hopeful that COVID will go away one day soon, hopefully before we get into winter. And I hope we can start to see some semblance of getting a little bit back to, and I hate the term new normal, but getting back to a little bit more predictable cycle for businesses and consumers as we get closer to the end of the year. We will still have some lingering unemployment, and the projections are that we will have quite a high unemployment rate as we get to the end of the year. So things will be different. But if we can get closer to where we are than today, that would be much better for many, many businesses.
Absolutely, agreed. Mike, thank you so much for your time. That was very insightful, and you make it so easy to understand. We know that it's a very heavy lift with PPP and understanding all that legislation, so thank you so much. Folks, with that being said, since we don't have any additional questions in our Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and close us out this afternoon. So if you still have questions, I know that's a lot of information to process. Please go ahead and email us at startupco@colorado.edu, and we will connect you with the right professional and expert to get your questions answered. You also, when you receive our follow-up email, you can always just reply back. It goes to the same email. We'll get your question answered as soon as possible. As always, all of the resources that you've seen here today will be included and linked in that follow-up email, but you can always visit northwestsbdc.org/COVID-19. And you can always visit the TellurIdeFoundation.org website to access all of these resources. You can also access Choose Colorado YouTube channel for all of the recordings that we've done since, oh my gosh, back to March. Everything's there for you. And keep in mind, and one thing I do really want to highlight, because I think it's really, really important, is that Energize Colorado has stood up a mental health service. And so it is a completely free service. You can find it out there on their website. It's a really underutilized service. And so I highly encourage you to check that out, as well as everything that Energize Colorado is offering here. So a big thank you to Mike. Thank you to Kat. Thank you for your time today. Thank you to this whole team. We will see you in 2 weeks on Wednesday at 1 o'clock. Thanks, folks. Bye, Colorado. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.